Good morning, Internet land, and welcome to the third in the Get in Shapes webinar series from the Financial Services Council. My name is Mark Benicevic. I'm the chair of the Advisor Transition Working Group in the Financial Services Council, and it is my pleasure in today's webinar to welcome back David Greenslade of Strategy and Tim Williams of Chapman Tripp. As I say, this is the third in our series. The previous two webinars are available on the FSC YouTube channel, which you can also find through the FSC website. And today's topic is around contracting, which is a really important area to get right in your business and one that you need to get started on early. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Mr. Greenslade.
So we're going to look at FAPs and suppliers and clients. So we're going to look across the whole spectrum of the sorts of contracts that you need to be contemplating for your FAP as we move towards 15 March of next year. So next slide there, Naomi. So just a brief recap on the last session, and that was all around discovering your FAP and advisor obligations on day one. So a key part of being ready to rock and roll on day one is having all of the advisors or whoever is going to provide your regulated financial advice service, whoever they are, need to be locked and loaded via some form of contract. And so that's what we're going to sort of look at today. If you want to go back and recap, well, then the link is there for you to go back and have a look at. So on this next slide, which is our agenda, you can see there that Tim Williams from Chapman Tripp will briefly talk about why contracts are important, and then we'll step through a number of different contracts that you need to be aware of, starting with the product manufacturer, because many of you will be closely aligned in providing advice on specific products where there are quite detailed and onerous, in some cases, contracts that you need to be aware of. And then we'll start off with financial advisors and progressively move through to authorised bodies, briefly mention outsourced providers and client agreements, and hand back to Mark by Q2. So let's get underway. So let's look at why are contracts important. So from a legal perspective, Tim, your views?
Well, for a start, financial advice providers have legal responsibility under the legislation for the advice being given. They have a range of duties under sections 431, etc., through, and also have license conditions. And they need to engage the financial advisors who work with them and ensure that they comply with their obligations. So the advice is being given on behalf of the FAP, and so that links that responsibility for it. Now, in order to ensure that financial advisors provide suitable advice to the clients, there need to be a whole range of processes and procedures, and these need to be backed up and enforced by a contractual commitment from the financial advisor to act in accordance with those arrangements. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because you need to almost analyse every one of the obligations. A financial advice provider needs to analyse every one of those obligations it has and work out how it's going to ensure it's going to meet those obligations, bearing in mind it's responsible for a whole range of other people in the financial advisor situation. So in those cases, the contract should reflect things like record keeping. If you've got an obligation to keep records, then you need the financial advisors to provide you with the records in question. It goes right through all of the obligations, and we'll talk about, David will talk about outsourcing contracts, and indeed another reason why you need a contract. There's a whole range of these things, but essentially you need to make sure that there is some contractual obligation for the parties who are providing arrangements or support to a FAP to ensure they comply. The flip side, of course, is that for financial advisors, they need contracts as well to ensure that their interests are protected. And effectively, contracts are arrangements that ensure that the legal obligations between the parties are settled in advance, so it avoids disputes in the future. So that's the start of the range of reasons. I could go on, but we will always be pressed for time on these sort of presentations. And so I'll pass back to David.
Great, thanks, Tim. So just think about your license requirements. So when you're applying for your license after the 15th of March 2021, your license application is effectively your undertaking to the FMA around how you are going to operate your business. So the FMA will either grant or not grant your license, and either provide special conditions or not provide special conditions based upon what you say in your license. So what you say is what you must do. So therefore, the FMA is expecting any FAP will have contracts in place as a key component of ensuring that what their undertakings are actually being delivered by those whom they employ, be either employed directly as financial advisors and nominated representatives, or via authorised bodies or interposed persons.
This comes back to the point, doesn't it, David, that that you need to be able to demonstrate your ability to comply, and contractual documentation will be an important part of that component. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So what then happens is the outsourced provider standard conditions that you'd have seen in the consultation paper that just came out, that actually specifically states that you must have an agreement in place with your outsourced providers. So we'll cover that in more depth sort of towards the end. But your contracts become the whole structure under which you control and operate your FAP. And that's why it's sort of a little bit concerning, I suppose, at the moment for many of us, and that what we're seeing is discussions are going on between various parties that are going to become FAPs and people who are going to join FAPs, but little discussion has been around the detail of how much do I have to pay to belong to this FAP, what are my obligations when I belong to this FAP, and what do I get in return. And so you need to be putting all of that in writing, getting it legally reviewed, because that's the basis of the proposition that you take out to those that you're going to try and encourage to join your FAP. So all of this takes time, because legal agreements need to be thought through. You'll do multiple drafts. You'll come up with the document. You'll need to test it. You need to make sure that what you've drafted is going to be commercially sensible. And then you've got to go out and do the negotiations. If you already have staff or advisors or whatever that you have a relationship with and you're taking them into the new entity, then in many instances you have to renegotiate to a certain extent those existing in-force contracts. And that doesn't happen in 5 minutes. So all of this takes time, and our strong advice is get started sooner rather than later. So Tim, anything you want to talk about around the value of a contract when everything turns to custard?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So many of you will be in the insurance space or the wealth space, and of course you understand risk better than the average population. Contracts are in a way like an insurance arrangement. Often they get put in the bottom drawer and forgotten about when things go well. And when things go wrong, you look for these things to see what you actually agreed at the outset. So it's really important for all parties to actually engage in the process of drafting a contract, because effectively it's like setting the risk parameters for your business. There'll be aspects that you'll need to try and forecast as to, if there's a dispute, what is it? What would you want the agreement to say? And as David says, it's also going to the contracts will definitely need to be renegotiated, because FAPs will need to bring in things like obligation entitlements to come and monitor the performance of their financial advisors, and to supervise and require training that might not have been in the previous contracts, or indeed other requirements that the FAP has to meet effectively for the group will be imposed on financial advisors. And that's one of the things that links back to the previous one of the previous sessions on whether you want to be your own, if you're a financial advisor, whether you want to operate on your own or under someone else's FAP. And that has a lot to do with the control that a FAP has to have effectively to be able to run its business appropriately over the business of its financial advisors, because of the legal obligations that are imposed on it by legislation.
Great, thanks, Tim. So not all contracts are actually in writing. So we have these things called implied contracts and express contracts. And so most of us are thinking about the contracts that are in writing and that are normally sort of enforceable. But Tim, do you want to talk briefly about the two and what actually happens if there isn't a written contract in place and advisors move into the new regime with a FAP and they just pick up whatever happens to be there and they just happen to run with that?
Yeah, implied contracts happen all the time. For example, if you go into a store and you buy something, you don't have a written contract for buying that. So courts in those circumstances, and if there isn't a written contract between a financial advisor and a FAP, and there's clear payment and consideration being provided both sides, courts will try and construct what they think is the reasonable terms the parties would have agreed in the context. That, of course, is much more expensive than writing it out yourself and agreeing it in advance. So if you get into a dispute, it's far better to have a written contract than having an implied terms. It's rather like being in the position of not having a written will when you die. There's a process, a much more complicated process to go through. You'll probably end up where you should have in the end, but the process is harder. And it also, if you write your written contract, you're able to tailor for unique circumstances in your own business. So if there's something peculiar about you want to agree with your FAP or important to you, then you get a chance to actually articulate what that is in the agreement itself. So far better to have express contracts than rely on implied ones.
Great, thanks for that. So in the next slide, we're talking about the relationship between a FAP and a manufacturer. So, and this is particularly relevant if you're dealing with the life insurance companies and with the banks when it comes to mortgage, and also in many instances for general insurance. So I'm aware that a number of product manufacturer agreements are out in the market, and I talk regularly with advisors and I say to them, have you read the contract before you signed it? And many instances they say, well, I've glanced at it, but there's nothing I can do, so I've just signed it and sent it back. Now, that's a commercial decision you make, and probably you may not be able to alter the terms. But the important thing to keep in the back of your mind is these new contracts have a number of obligations that you, as the financial advisor and future FAP, must comply with. And in many instances, if you don't comply with them to the full extent, then you may find that you are terminated, and some of those termination clauses may also result in you no longer receiving trail commission, or in some instances even upfront commission. So what we're advocating is closely read those agreements, and once you've read them, make a note of what all the obligations are that are in that agreement and all of the reporting conditions that you have to comply with, and make sure you build those into your obligations register and into your compliance assurance plan. And from a contractual perspective, you need to mirror whatever the product manufacturer agreements are into your FAP agreement so that they are sort of mirrored down through either your financial advisors, contractors, or authorised bodies. So, Tim, anything you briefly want to say about this? Because you've probably drafted a whole heap of these.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think the thing that comes into this, and it's a sort of a convenient time, I guess, for manufacturers, and by manufacturers we mean the issuers of the products, insurance companies and banks and fund managers. The manufacturers are under pressure for conduct and culture reasons from the FMA RBNZ inquiry. And so there will be things that they need now to impose on the FAPs. And you've seen already that there's been some banks announcing that they will only deal with FAPs in their distribution and in certain components, the mortgage advisors, etc. And so there is an opportunity here for, well, it's likely that manufacturers are going to look at their agreements again and start imposing things. Also out there in the future is the COFI legislation, which is going to impose duties on manufacturers to monitor more their FAPs. And so all of that means that there is a changing framework in this area as well.
Great, thanks for that. So let's now move on to looking at a FAP and a contractor agreement. So just a create the context, the contractors we're talking about here are people who are self-employed advisors who are then contracting through to the licensed FAP or contracting through to an authorised body, which is an unlicensed FAP, to provide services. So it's different from a salaried employee. Now, the first thing to have a look at is the whole test around contractor versus employee relationship. In other words, the master-servant relationship. In today's world, you could be a contractor and be working under someone else's brand and under someone else's business, and there may not be a whole heap of controls that are imposed upon you. But once you move into a FAP relationship, then the licensed FAP is likely to impose a lot more control over how you operate and the way you deliver the service than what you have had imposed on you before. So that means now you're moving closer and closer to this whole issue around master-servant and whether you are truly a contractor or an employee. And you see this issue coming up with courier drivers and a multitude of other industries. So Tim, is anything sort of from a legal perspective you want to talk about around this?
I think this is an opportunity for your contract to articulate what the role and relationship is, so there's clarity there. At the same time, there are times where even if you say you're a contractor, the employment courts may deem you to be an employee if you have a relationship that is so similar to being an employee. Probably not, it's not worth going into that too much, but that would mean attending the office for a regular period of time that corresponds with a typical employee and not working independently. So it's probably not something that's going to occur very often, but it could occur in some cases. So it's worth being aware of that issue.
And so, Tim, when we're talking about contractors, are we talking about individuals or are we talking about companies that are contracting to the FAP?
It could be either. There are limitations, license limitations on engaging companies, particularly during transition. The arrangements need to be in place in, I think it's May 2019, to be able to contract with companies. So a lot of the arrangements will be directly with the individual. If the individuals have companies, this is a bit more of a complicated point, so if you're not ready for it, please don't listen to this point, but individuals, if they are acting as an employee of their own company, that company can then be giving advice if they're giving advice. So this creates complications in structure, which we've talked about before, and I won't go into them again. But if you are thinking of wanting to have being a single individual, engaging directly, but at the same time acting as an employee of your own company, that adds some complexity that needs to be examined, and ensuring that the FAP can actually engage you when you're an employee of another company. So
Tim, then what about the situation where you've got a contractor who has his or her own client base, and now they're going to be a contractor to the FAP, versus someone who is going to deal with the FAP's clients and wants to be a contractor? So it's around the ownership.
Yes, well, that's a very good point, because under the legislation, advice now to be engaged by a FAP, you have to be giving advice on behalf of the FAP to the FAP's clients. So effectively, the legislation is almost deeming those customers of yours to belong to the FAP, and that's where a specifically designed contract could try and arrange some remuneration arrangement that reflects the fact that if you're an individual financial advisor bringing customers to the equation, that there's some recognition of the value and maybe even some separation arrangements, so that the financial advisor can take those customers away if the relationship is terminated.
Yeah, and these are the sort of discussions that we're seeing that are not happening on a regular basis at the moment, and yet it's fundamental to whether you would be joining FAP A or FAP B as a contractor. So it's all around, do I retain ownership of those clients? And if I do join a FAP as a contractor, then what obligations is the FAP imposing upon me? Are they draconian? Can I actually meet those obligations? Do I believe that they're fair and reasonable? Am I better off to agree to those for whatever upside benefit, or become my own FAP? So these are key things that a FAP needs to have worked out as far as what its obligations are going to be on whoever they bring into under their license, and that needs to be worked out before, in many cases, they get into the nitty-gritty around who's going to join. Conversely, what you have is, if you're going to have obligations, if you're joining a FAP, then you want to be saying to the transitionally licensed FAP, what are the services and support you are going to provide to me? And then how much is that going to cost me? And how do I actually pay for that? Do I pay a fee to you every week, fortnightly, or monthly? Or is it a percentage of the remuneration that I generate? But you've got to look at it if you're going to join a FAP and go, are those services realistic? Are they going to help me achieve whatever my own commercial business goals happen to be? So, Tim, anything around that you want to mention?
Yeah, I think referring back to the point I made before, contracts are means by which you can allocate risk between two parties. Very often in contracts of this nature, there are indemnities. If you think of it from a point of view of a FAP who is liable for the actions of the financial advisor, they may well want to impose indemnities on the financial advisor for if they breach the law and cause loss to the FAP. The FAP might well say, well, if you cause that, you should be liable to us and pay us for the consequences of your error or mistake. Conversely, there could be provisions that are the exact opposite of that, and saying, okay, well, the FAP will insure and take on responsibility for your liability, and that will be reflected in the fee. So these are the sorts of things that would be negotiated at this level in this type of contract. And as I said before, far better to have these clear at the beginning and understood and agreed than to leave them unsaid.
Great. So the last bullet point there is, I'm just referring to other terms that are similar to the authorised body agreement. And so you'll see some of those other terms a couple of slides further on. So let's just move on to the next one, which is a lot less complicated, and that's the FAP Employee Advisor Agreement. So this is where someone is a salaried employee of the licensed FAP or of the authorised body. So if they're already an employee, then use this opportunity to look at their existing employment agreement and update it. And in particular, you're looking at the position profile and the key performance indicators, the KPIs that you need to build around those. So you could try and build your own, and we've got a link there, or preferably go off and get legal advice around your employment agreement. As you're building the KPIs, remember that if these are advisors and you're going to have as part of the remuneration package some form of incentive program or bonus, then remember that the FMA now frowns upon any form of incentive structure where it's 100% value or volume based. So that means when you're building incentives, which is something you may want to do, think about the KPIs and go, the bonus structure will be a combination of meeting compliance and good conduct obligations. It will be meeting certain minimum client satisfaction levels. It will involve meeting internal policy process and teamwork hurdles. And obviously, you'll have some degree of productivity measurement in there, be it remuneration or quality or whatever. But no longer can you look at saying it's based solely and wholly on generating a minimum of X dollars revenue.
It's particularly true, isn't it, David? Because of in respect of bonuses or the like, where there is a non-linear relationship between remuneration or bonuses and commissions. So if there are targets or hurdles, then that is particularly offensive. In fact, that's likely to be prohibited when COFI comes into force in expected 2023.
Yeah, so Tim's mentioned COFI a couple of times. So COFI is obviously not law at this stage, and it may undergo some degree of change between now and whenever. But even if COFI doesn't come into force as a piece of legislation, it's fair to say that the intent behind what COFI's driving at will become standard for everyone within the industry. So you need to be thinking about not just meeting the minimum standards and thinking about taking your FAP and your contract to a much higher level to embrace the concept behind COFI. Now, Mark, you've got a couple of questions?
Yes, thank you, David. We've got a couple of questions from the floor. The first one that's come up a couple of times is an advisor that has their own company and their company has got a transitional license. And the question is, if I'm a financial advisor for my own company, should I have an employment agreement with my company?
The simple answer is yes, you do. And you need that for a couple of reasons, not least of which will be if something happens to you from a health and sickness perspective and you've got an income protection insurance policy, you want to make sure that that can pay out. And to do that, you need to have an employment agreement. Tim, anything you want to mention?
I guess part of the answer is yes, you do have an agreement, whether it's written or not. Everyone who's an employee has an agreement. The advantage of having a written one, of course, is you can stipulate its terms rather than having them implied, as we talked about before. But the other thought is that if you've got your own company, do you want to actually, if you are going to go to the documenting it, whether you turn that into a contractor relationship rather than an employment relationship, and there may be advantages in relation to if your company is not going to be the FAP in the way you engage with a FAP, and we can talk about that in detail if people are in that situation, because there are some quite complicated issues associated with that.
And the second one there, Mark?
The second question is actually really heavily related to contracting. If I should leave a financial advice provider who's been responsible for the advice I gave my clients, what access to my client files are they likely to expect for the next 7 years per legal obligations in the event there is a retroactive complaint or breach?
Right, and so the simple answer, and I'll get Tim to give the complex one, but the simple one is that's going to be governed and determined by what's in the contract. And so this is where it's so important to have the termination clauses correctly written so that all of this sort of stuff is spelt out up front. So Tim, you want to give the more complex
I agree with you absolutely, David. That is, you have no specific rights to the records of a FAP other than what you put into your contract.
Yeah, because there will be situations, Mark, where some FAPs will let people, once they terminate, to take their client base with them. There will be other FAPs that will say, well, we have an obligation now because whilst they were with us, we gave the advice, or you gave the advice on our behalf. So those clients remain with us. And in some instances, there may be a monetary compensation. In other cases, there may not be a monetary compensation, particularly if the licensed FAP had terminated the agreement because of non-performance or something like that. And that's why getting into the detail around the contracts is so vital before someone makes a decision to join a FAP. Anything, Tim, you want to mention?
No, I think you've done well there, David.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so
certainly the financial advice provider retains liability for the advice that's given while the advisor's in their FAP. So they will need to retain the data to be able to respond to any complaints or deal with any breaches. So yeah, that is a really interesting question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, gentlemen.
So let's move on to authorised bodies. So just as a contextual thing, an authorised body is an unlicensed FAP. So it is a FAP, financial advice provider. It just doesn't hold the license directly with the FMA. But it has an obligation to ensure that whoever is working underneath it, be it either financial advisors or nominated representatives, are meeting the same standards that are required by the licensed FAP. So the contract that we're talking about here between the two parties, between the FAP and the authorised body, is all around clearly defining what is that relationship. So, and that will include things like who actually owns the clients. Do the clients immediately go across to the licensed FAP, or do they remain with the authorised body, or whatever the case happens to be? There will be some form of approval mechanism for the AB to join the FAP. So the FAP will need to have some form of due diligence around why it's decided to bring authorised body ABC under its licence, and what are those criteria, and what is the approval mechanism for retaining that authorised body within the FAP. Because if you're an authorised body, in fact, if you're a contractor as well, once you're into a FAP, depending upon the services that the FAP have provided, it becomes quite difficult in some instances to easily exit. Because if you're working under a licensed FAP, and that licensed FAP provides all the systems, the processes, the technology, so you're using the licensed FAP CRM, all of that documentation, all of their contracts, then when you exit and you're trying to move away from that licensed FAP, you somehow have to undo all of that and extract your data out of the system and be able to move that to somewhere else. So all of that needs to be worked through and clearly understood before you sign any agreement. So Tim, anything you want to mention around that?
No, just to reiterate what we've said in an earlier session, I believe that authorised bodies add a layer of complexity, that there must be a better way of solving the structural problems that arise here than have authorised bodies. Because effectively authorised bodies have a whole lot of duplication and a whole lot of monitoring between the FAP and processes between the FAP and the authorised body that could be avoided. One client we advised on this, who had an employment company separate from its advisory companies, and they had several. We talked about it at length and explained all of what we've said, and ultimately we decided that it was best to amalgamate all the companies, so you had a single company within the group who was going to be the FAP and engaging every advisor, even if they had different specialties, rather than keeping all the specialties separate. So that's one of the areas where an authorised body has been contended would be a useful solution. I don't agree where you've got an organised group. Secondly, the other situation where you might use it is where an advisor has a company and wants to hit that company to become an authorised body of the FAP, where the FAP and the authorised body are completely unrelated and independent, and the relationship is between the advisor and the company. I think a FAP would be, there are better ways for the FAP to engage with the individual than go through the authorised body mechanism. So the liability structures, etc., make it, exposes the FAP more, I think, than some of the alternatives. So for all those reasons, if your answer is authorised body, ask the question again until you're absolutely sure, because I'm sure that there would be a better way of doing things.
Right. So authorised bodies is not a free ticket in FAP land. So an authorised body, because it's a FAP in its own right, still has obligations. It still has to have systems and processes and controls in place so that the licensed FAP has a degree of comfort that whoever is operating underneath the authorised body is following the same standards that the FAP or the licensed FAP has imposed. So that's where there will be a degree of oversight. There would be, some people may regard that as being intrusive if you're running your own business, but that's the reality of what you would sign up to as part of that agreement. And once again, as with contractors, you've got to look at it and you've got to go, right, what services and support does the FAP provide to my authorised body? And in return, how much do I have to pay of the remuneration through to the licensed FAP? And then how does that remuneration actually work? Does the authorised body physically collect the money and then pay it up to the licensed FAP? Or does all remuneration get paid directly by the product provider or by the client to the licensed FAP, who then takes out their clip and then pays whatever has been agreed upon down to the authorised body? So these are key commercial decisions that need to be documented, needed to be thought through, tested, and so on and so forth. Because if you're a licensed FAP and you decide that all remuneration comes through to the license holder, who then disperses it from there, then depending on the size of your FAP, you'll need a pretty sophisticated piece of software to do all of this form of fee and commission splitting. And so that's another piece of technology that you need to put into your project plan around building your FAP. And then we get into the tricky issue around marketing. And so if you've got an authorised body and a licensed FAP, then whose brand do we operate under? Is the agreement going to be such that you only operate under the licensed FAP? Or as an authorised body, do you operate or can you operate under your own brand? And if that's the case, then what do you have to say and do, and how frequently and where and so on forth do you have to refer back to the license holder? Or do you have to run both brands? So Tim, you'll be giving some advice to some of your clients at the moment, sort of where are they going in this sort of area?
Well, in both areas we've just talked about, marketing and remuneration, the shortest and most concise answer is there is nothing that is standard. And that's why we're saying that contracts are important, because you get to, both parties get to sort out the arrangements they want between themselves. And there, as I say, there's a range of variables on both these points that really need to be tailored for the particular circumstances, and that's where contracts come in.
Great, thanks. So on the next slide around authorised bodies and the various terms, we'll just briefly skip through these because of time, but they're similar to what you'd have with a contractor as well. So we've talked about remuneration flows. We've talked about what happens if the authorised body is not performing to standard. How does the licensed holder terminate, and what are the implications of termination? Likewise, if the licensed FAP is not providing the services it's undertaken to provide, how does the authorised body extract themselves from that agreement and keep their value intact? We then have record keeping and security and all of those sorts of normal things that you need to be sort of mindful of. Do the records now sit up at the licensed FAP level, or do all the records sit in amongst the individual authorised bodies? And then we get into the tricky situation around who indemnifies who for what, and the insurance, like PI cover. As you've seen in the consultation paper, they're talking about making PI insurance mandatory. So does the licensed FAP take that on behalf of everyone, or does each AB have its own insurance? And does the licensed FAP have a minimum criteria around how all of that works? And before I hand over to Tim for some further comments, think carefully about your future commercial direction if you're going to be an authorised body belonging to a FAP. How do you sell your business? If you sell your business, can you only sell it to the license holder, or are you free to go and sell your business to whomever you want to? In other words, the highest market price out there. And can you assign your clients to another party? And all of this obviously is linked in with restraint of trade around, if you do terminate and you leave, is there any restraint as the ex-authorised body around what you can do? So Tim, you want to put some legal input into that?
Well, I think it just reinforces the point, and we've only got limited time, but it reinforces the point that all of these are variables that you want to examine and negotiate when making the decision as a financial advisor to join a FAP, or equally as a FAP when setting the terms it wants to offer to the financial advisors. The sale of the business will be, I imagine, very important to financial advisors indemnities and insurance, and that way actually a plug on in the insurance. You mentioned the FMA consultation paper. That, of course, is not set in stone, and it may be a very good submission to make that the FAP doesn't need to get PI insurance if every one of its financial advisors get it. Maybe that could be proposed as part of that process. In the consultation, there are changes made. So if you are in a position, particularly of being a larger organisation, can afford the time and effort, then submissions can have significant impacts on the legislation, or in this case, on the proposed licence conditions.
Great, thanks, Tim. So in the interest of time, we'll just move on and look at outsourced providers. So just as way of definition, an outsourced provider is where you look at what are the key license obligations I have, what are the fundamentals that I have as a financial advice provider that is part of my license. And if I decide not to do those in-house and I outsource them to another third party, then what you've got to do is have agreements in place where you have absolute comfort and confidence, and you can demonstrate to the FMA that it's the case, that your outsourced provider is meeting the same or higher standards that you would be doing if you're undertaking the work in-house, and that those standards are what you have included in your license application. So in other words, just going to the cheapest, easiest outsourced provider may not necessarily be the best solution, because their standards and their capability may not be sufficient to meet whatever you have undertaken to the FMA you are going to do. So in the proposed standard conditions in the consultation paper, FMA has mentioned outsourced providers or outsourced providers and having an agreement in place. And there's some pretty standard sort of key terms that all FMCA outsourced providers or provider agreements need to meet. And Tim, you just briefly want to talk about those, just in no more than a minute.
In the consultation, they talk about allowing effective monitoring of the outsourced provider. So that's an obligation that isn't always in outsourced arrangements, and you'll need to have access to information, certifications from them, perhaps, that they are complying, even the ability to audit if you have concerns. All of that needs to be built into a contract, because you don't have those implicitly as a matter of right. And then the ability to terminate in case of breaches, and the standards on which you can terminate will need to be linked into compliance with laws. So these contracts, again, the devil's in the detail, and there's not just a one size fits all. But there are a number of provisions that you'll need to think about, including these that traditionally may not have been in standard outsource agreements.
Yeah, and certainly the FMA wants to have assurance that it can access your records that are sitting with an outsourced provider. So that definitely needs to be built into the agreement. And obviously, in many cases, if you're subject to audit or compliance review and things like that, you need to have built into your agreements the ability for whomever those third parties are that are undertaking those compliance audits or reviews, that they also have access to the records, both the client records and obviously the records of the outsourced providers. So, that's a whole area that we look at, and you'd have all of that built into your outsourced provider policy and so on and so forth. So if we just move on briefly to client agreements, because what we're talking about here is...
just before we do, we've got a question about outsourcing. How can a FAP ensure its outsourced providers are meeting and fulfilling the FAP's obligations? So a question about monitoring the outsourced providers.
Yeah, okay. So that will depend largely on the size of the organisation. So the first thing you do is you have the appropriate agreement in place. And the agreement should talk about service level standards and time frames and things like that. So if I put my Strategize compliance hat on, the sort of outsourced provider agreements we're providing to future FAPs talks around delivery dates. So if we're undertaken to do something, we must do it by a certain date so that the FAP can meet regulatory reporting turnaround timeframes. There are standards around our sampling and what we're going to do and not do, and the pricing and all of those things. So the agreement is absolutely key. The next thing you then do is you go, how do I monitor this? So if you're at the bigger end of town, you will have formal meetings with your outsourced providers where you may be annually or whatever going through due diligence checklists and so on and so forth. You may have some form of certification whereby the outsourced provider is confirming back to you, be it monthly, annually or whatever, that they have undertaken to whatever standards you've agreed in the contract, that they've done everything that they said they would do in the contract. From a day-to-day practical perspective, it comes down to the grumbles and the mumbles and the complaints of the staff. So if you have got an outsourced provider that is, say, holding your data or is your CRM provider, and your staff are constantly bitching and moaning about poor delivery timeframes, things aren't working properly and no one's getting back to me, I don't know how to work it, and all of that sort of stuff, that is symptomatic of your outsourced provider not adequately fulfilling the contract terms or poorly drafted contract terms. And so when these things happen, what you've got to do is engage with your outsourced provider. You don't wait, you engage immediately, be it by phone, by letter, email or whatever, and you nip the issue in the bud as soon as you possibly can. Tim, anything you want to say around any of that?
I think you've covered most of it. The importance of the contract and anticipating the processes you need to go to meet the new standards. Absolutely.
Right. So on client agreements, what we're saying here is this is a golden opportunity to not just put in place the good documentation that all good businesses need, but to fundamentally rethink and rejig your advice process. A key component of that is the actual client agreement. And you may have a client agreement initially around the scope of service, and then you may have a further client agreement further down the track around implementation of whatever your recommendations are and ongoing review. Now, under the new code that will come into effect on the 15th of March next year, a financial advice provider needs to take reasonable steps to ensure the client understands the advice and the scope of service that they've engaged in. And so a key component of understanding that is to put any T's and C's, terms and conditions, in plain English. So keep the thing clear, concise, and effective. Keep it short and sharp. Don't use jargon. Don't use too much legalese. Now, it's a heck of a lot harder to write plain English, short, sharp agreements than it is to put in all the big, long-winded stuff. So, Tim, do you want to make some comments around unfair contract terms and disclaimers and all of that sort of stuff?
The first point I should make is that contracts are a lot more readable nowadays than they were 15, 20 years ago. And so lawyers understand that they don't write legalese and try and make things readable, particularly at the retail level. But moving on from that point, which I felt I needed to make, if a contract is too much in favour of one party and there's a unilateral power being exercised, care needs to be given to ensure that it doesn't offend against the unfair contract term provisions in the Fair Trading Act. And so that's something to bear in mind when you're drafting them. But you have to be pretty extreme to get into the realms of that area. You've got down there disclaimers. May I move on to that? Disclaimers can be workable. They can be very effective. And I've seen court cases where the judge says, if it wasn't for the disclaimer of liability, which the parties clearly understood and agreed when they entered into, and both got legal advice and when consulted on it, then there would be a different outcome to this case. So they can be effective, but they've got to be carefully drafted because they are they're interpreted against the person who proposed them in whose favour they're going to act. And so there is an art in drafting those particularly. And don't forget the legal bits. Couldn't emphasise that more.
Yeah. So the key things, Tim. So the key takeout from this particular slide is don't just take your existing wording around client agreements and stick that into your new documents. Look at this as an opportunity to redraft absolutely everything you do. So just bringing it all together and summarising where we're at and what we've sort of covered off on. So the first thing to have a look at is the right agreements need to be in place before the new regime commences. Remembering we're talking 15th of March, and both Tim and I believe it's going to take you all of that time, if not more, to go through the thought process and the consultation with all of those that you're looking at bringing into your FAP, to make sure that the contracts that you put in place are fair and reasonable, they are commercially sensible, and that both parties understand the obligations and the payments that they need to make. Also, your contracts need to be enforceable, because if you're the licensed FAP, the buck effectively stops with you. So you need to make sure you've got powers through your agreement to ensure that the standards that you are beholden to are being fulfilled by all those under your license. So time is of the essence from this sort of perspective. So any closing comments from you there, Tim?
Yeah, no, I think the point about time being important and it evaporates very quickly is one to make. I mean, I don't think we're at the stage where, you know, the alarm bells are quite need to go off, other than to say it's time to think about this now and get on with it. We're seeing people at various stages of the process. The key message on all of this, though, is that the duties start on the 15th of March next year. The transition arrangements are really around full licensing components and qualifications, but all of the duties start from day one. So that's something that a number of people we've talked to haven't quite fully appreciated. And also, it's going to be a very busy time early next year. So it would be good to commence drafting your documentation and thinking about the processes, you know, nowish or going or very soon if you haven't already started. As we said at the end of our first slides, I would be feeling a wee bit uncomfortable if I was a financial advisor, or even more so likely to be a FAP, if I hadn't concluded now on what my intended structure is going to be and engaged, if you're a financial advisor, with the FAP that I intend to join, if that's the case, and get a clear understanding that they are going to accept the financial advisor. Anyway, that's probably about it for me. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Tim. So what do you need to do now as far as next steps are concerned? So what we're talking about here is making sure you go back and look at all existing contracts you have in place and go, are they able to transfer across to the new regime? If no, then what new contracts do I need to get put in place? And so you need to get professional advice around that. If you've got some specific questions, then both my contact details and those of Tim are there, and you're welcome to have a look at that. So in the interest of time, I'll hand back to you, Mark, and thanks very much.
Thank you, David. I'd probably go one step forward further as well and say, take a look at all of the relationships you have with external parties and ensure that you have contracts with those external parties, because you may find that you have got some relationship at the moment where you haven't got anything written down at all. So include those in those review as well. A huge thank you to Tim and to David for this presentation. It's a really complex area, and you know, as financial advisors, our job is to go out to clients and to say, you need advice to understand the minefield of what's going on in your life, whether it comes to life and health advice or investment advice, whatever it may be. Now, this is a time when we as financial advisors need advice ourselves for how to work our way through this and make sure that you have the required contracts and so forth. We're not all lawyers, so get advice when you need help. So a huge thank you to Tim and to David for today's presentation. I hope you got a lot out of it. I'm afraid it may just whet your appetite. There is a poll on the screen now. Please answer the poll. It gives us an idea of the sorts of things that you'd like to see in future webinars. And our next webinar in 2 weeks' time is going to cover maintaining your compliance with the Financial Advisors Act before the 15th of March 2021 when the new law is implemented. So the Financial Advisors Act continues to apply until the 15th of March 2021. That date was announced yesterday, and on the 15th of March 2021, all of the new requirements come into force on the same day, and transitional licenses came into effect on that same day as well. So transitional licenses have no effect until the 15th of March next year. Thank you very much for our presenters for their time this morning. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.